Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. Today I'd like to present my fourth and final lesson covering that 400-year period that separated the Old from the New Testament. In our first lesson of the 400 years, I showed you this chart that I want to review, showing that during this period of 400 years, it's going to be mainly dominated the first 200 years by the Persians are going to rule the world for 200 years, from approximately 536 to 336 BC. Then the Greeks are going to come to power first with Alexander the Great. He conquers that Persian Empire, and the Greeks are going to rule the world for 300 years, leading up to the time in 63 BC when Rome comes to power. And of course, it's going to be in the days of the Roman empires that Jesus will be born and that the church will be established. Now, during this period of 400 years, some important things that happened. We see the rise in the importance of people in Israel known as scribes. Now, before the time of captivity, these scribes were like governmental secretaries and copiers of the Old Testament law. They gained prominence during this period of captivity. One important example is Ezra, the scribe. We have one of the historical books of the Old Testament was written by the scribe Ezra. We can see that when the priests became corrupt during this period between the Testament because of the outside influences from the Hellenists, that is, those were the people who tried to push the Greek culture onto the Jewish people. And the scribes became, at that time, very zealous defenders of the law. We see even in New Testament time that the scribes were highly respected men. They were mainly active in Jerusalem, but we also have them mentioned being in Galilee. They're most often seen in the scriptures being associated with the Pharisees, who were one of the strictest sects of Judaism. But they're also sometimes mentioned alone in the New Testament scriptures. They're also called lawyers in that they were the legal experts of the law, and they were also called doctors because they were the doctors of the law. They taught in the synagogues and all higher learning in Israel, and they were also an important element of the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was the Jewish high council that was made up of 70 men of Israel, and this included the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Another important development that took place during these 400 years between the Old and New Testament is the development of synagogue worship. I mentioned this in an earlier video, how that prior to captivity, the Jewish people, their worship mainly focused around the temple and animal sacrifices. But as a result of being scattered out into the Gentile world, this is when synagogue worship was developed. The synagogue was comprised of when you had to have at least 10 men to start a synagogue. There was no particular design or uniform pattern for the building of synagogues, but they did usually face Jerusalem. They were organized in such a way that there was a ruler who presided over and arranged the services. He appointed the people, such as who would read or who would speak. There was a servant, a salaried person, who had many roles. He would care for the building. He would beat off offenders, that is, protect the building. He would teach and also serve as an attendant, one who would deliver the scriptures to those who were going to read in the synagogue. The synagogue became an important part of Jewish society. It was the center of their community. It was the center of religious and social life. It served many times as a school, as a house of prayer, as a meeting house, place of judgment, and they even provided guest rooms for Jews who may be traveling on a journey. They organized charity, and that was an important part of Judaism. And they would feed the poor, clothe the needy, care for the sick, bury the dead, educate the orphans, and they would even redeem their Jewish brothers who may have fallen captive to other people. And they also provided dowries for poor girls in the event of marriage. The worship of the synagogue comprised mainly of two parts just of prayer and scripture reading. They would pray and also confess any wrongs that they might be doing. They would meet not only on the Sabbath day but also on market days, which were Monday and Thursday. They would many times chant, do some chants from some of the Psalms. They would, of course, meet on the feast days, and of course the Hebrew Scripture would be read, and then many times they would allow someone to speak after the reading. And we see this in the New Testament that the apostles used this as a way to spread the gospel, because when they go to a new town, they go to the synagogue of the Jews, because there you had people who believed in the one true God, and you had the scriptures, and they would begin at those Old Testament scriptures to preach Christ. So after the reading, when the attendant would ask if they say, do you have words of exhortation? This is when Paul and the apostles would take an opportunity then to preach Christ. Another important aspect of this 400-year period that we've already mentioned, we had seen that during the time of the Greeks, when the Seleucid rulers ruled Syria, that it was during this time that God's people were controlled either by the Seleucid rulers of Syria or the Ptolemies of Egypt. And we had seen that it was during one of the Seleucid rulers, a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, that served as a particular time of persecution for God's people. Matter of fact, that Antiochus was one of the little horns that's mentioned in the book of Daniel. Well, this Antiochus, as we've already mentioned, that he's the one that set up pagan shrines throughout the land of Palestine and demanded that they offer swine. Well, there was a Jewish priest, Matthias Maccabee, who lived some 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem, but he refused to offer these sacrifices. And when another Jew did, he killed him. He also killed the Seleucid general and several soldiers. And he and his 5 sons then fled into the Palestine countryside and began guerrilla warfare. When Matthias died a year later, it was his oldest son Judas who took control of the family and kind of led the fight. He was a great military leader. His nickname was the Hammer. And as a result, he was eventually able to regain Jerusalem, build a new altar, cleanse the temple, and reinstate the daily sacrifices that had been stopped under Antiochus Epiphanes. And this great victory for the Jewish people is celebrated by Hanukkah, because this cleansing of the temple occurred on December 14th, 164 BC. And so that's why even to this day the Jewish people celebrate the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah as it's otherwise known. And that's to commemorate this great victory for the Jewish people. The fighting between the Syrians and the Maccabees continued for several years until they eventually signed a treaty with Rome in 139 BC. And this established them as a ruling dynasty there in the land of Palestine. And their family name was Homocenes. And these Homocenes became then wealthy and powerful. And we see at the time of Christ that they had become a lot less religious and a lot more political. But they weren't really good political leaders, and so the Rome felt it necessary to take over Palestine again and 63 BC. And it was also during this time, because of this clash between the political influences and the religious influences, that we see a rise in what we call the Jewish sects. Now, there were 5 main sects of the Jews that developed at this time. The most prominent group was known as the Pharisees. They believed in a more strict adherence to the law, both oral and written. They were condemned by Jesus, of course, because of their self-righteousness and by being too legalistic. But there were a lot of good people also among the Pharisees. That included like Nicodemus, Gamaliel, and of course even the Apostle Paul described himself as being raised as a Pharisee. Now, another group that developed during this 400-year period was known as the Sadducees. They were fewer in number than the Pharisees, but they were more powerful. They consisted of some of the upper class people, and they had control of the temple. But ironically, they were more political, being friends of Rome, and they did not believe in angels, did not believe in life after death, or God's providence. And the only part of the Old Testament scriptures they accepted were the books of the law, the first 5 books of Moses. Another group developed at this time was called the Herodians, and they were a group among the Jewish people who believed in the rule of the family of Herod. They're only mentioned twice in the New Testament, both times as siding with the Pharisees to oppose Jesus. Another group was known as the Zealots. These were people who wanted to openly rebel against Rome and throw them off with a sword. And then a final group was known as the Essenes. These were the people who wanted to withdraw from society and to keep the law to the letter. And it was these Essenes, people who went out in the Dead Sea regions, the ones who gathered the Dead Sea Scrolls, a great discovery that was made in 1947. Now, before we close, I want to take another look at this family of Herod, because it was during this time, this 400-year period, that a man by the name of Antipater, who was actually a descendant of the Edomites, he came into favor with Rome. And then, of course, after he was given rule of Palestine. When he died, his son, Herod the Great, ruled all the provinces of Palestine. Upon his death, his son Archelaus reigned in Judea, and Herod Antipas, of course, was given Galilee. Well, another one of his sons, Philip, is mentioned in the New Testament scriptures. And then we have his grandson, Herod Agrippa I. He's mentioned in the book of Acts. He's the one who kills the Apostle James, arrests Peter, but is later struck dead by God. And then his son, great-grandson, Herod Agrippa II, is the one who Paul, of course, testified before him, and he's the one who made that famous statement before Paul, you almost persuaded me to be a Christian. So this kind of concludes some of the main things I wanted to point out about that period between the Testaments. And we'll begin next week, or our next lesson, looking at things that apply to the New Testament period. Thanks for joining me, and hope you'll join me again.